and over to yourself.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Sabine de Holland. Today, we're going to go over El Greco and beyond, the Iberian painters from 1400 to 1600. Before we begin, I have three things. I went out in public for the first time and I have caught a cold, so I apologize if I cough. Secondly, if you hear my dog, he's very loud. And thirdly, this is the first class I've ever taught for the SCA. You guys are my guinea pigs, so my apologies and congratulations. Before we begin, I wanted to talk about who we're going to talk about today, and that is the painters not just from Spain and Portugal, but anyone who was painting in Spain or Portugal at that time, and it includes foreigners who came into the area. So when I began my research project for this, I went to my favorite two books. One is Gardner's, it's an older copy, and the other is The History of Art, which is about this thick. And the information isn't always accurate, but it's a good place to start, and there's lots of pictures, and that's where I usually go. When I went there, Gardner's had nothing to say about Spanish painting. They lumped El Greco in with the Baroque, which is not where he belongs. When I went to my other favorite book, they had only one line to say, and that was that Spanish painting was too provincial to note. And that's just not right. I've been to Spain. I have seen all sorts of paintings from this time period, and I know that there's a lot to talk about. So the question is, when I started my research, why is it that nobody wanted to talk about what's going on in Spain and Portugal at this time? And why aren't there paintings that people want to talk about? Now, of course, we've got the Renaissance masters coming out of Italy and out of Flemish schools. And they, of course, overshadow what's going on in the rest of Europe at this time period. But what's going on in Spain? Well, we've got different kingdoms with different kings and queens in Spain at the time. It's not a unified country. And the same thing is going on in Portugal until we get to Fernand and Isabella, where they unite their two kingdoms. We also have the Reformation going on in the rest of Europe. And then, the Iberian Peninsula is very focused on being Catholic and insular in trying to protect themselves from what's going on in the rest of Europe. We also have the Inquisition, of course, and the expulsion of the Muslims, and we're losing all sorts of talent as they are forced out or forced to convert. What else is going on? Well, we've got the sack of Rome. And the other thing that's really important to note is that there's no art schools in Spain. So if you're a painter in this time period, you're either going to Italy or you're going to Northern Europe. You're not going to Spain. So there's nothing to bring painters to the country. We've got Charles V was not a fan of art. And we've also got, sorry, let me back up a little bit. We've also got the, Columbus and the expansion and colonialism. So there's a lot of war and there's a lot of other things to focus on. And it's just not a good environment for artists. After Charles V, we get to Philip II. Say what you will about him as a ruler, but he's a patron of the arts. And this is the first time we really see this in this time period, having a true patron of the arts for painting. Obviously sculpture and other thing, and architecture, that's a different topic, and that's also going on. But for painting, Philip II, he is a real patron, and he brings the Spanish court to Madrid. He brings all of the court folks together. This creates a patronage in a centralized location, and he invites painters to come to Spain. He also meets painters like Titian, who never came to Spain, but became the unofficial Spanish court painter and was sending paintings to Spain. And we'll talk a lot about how Titian influenced painters in the 1500s. Philip II's big project was El Escorial, and it is full of painters. They're following the traditions of Italy and the Netherlands, and it is a massive undertaking. And so by the time we get to that period, we're really seeing painting taking off. And that explains how we go from a time period where the historians say there's not really anything to talk about to right after 1600, we launch ourselves into the golden age of Spanish painting. I mean, how do you go from nothing to the golden age? Well, there's a lot to unpack. So let's get started with the 1400s. We'll just briefly go through them. This is really, with everything going on in Spain, the time period where painting really suffers. And we see that. And we also see a lot of painters that aren't noted. So we don't know their names, they're anonymous. So there's not a lot of details that we have for these folks in some cases, but let's get started. If my screen will, there we go. This is the map of the ununified Spain, and Portugal, same deal. So this is around the time period. Here we're looking at a painting by Luis Dalmo. He was a court painter for Alonso V of Aragon in Valencia in 1428. Then he went to Bruges in 1431, and you can clearly see in this painting the references to Jan van Eyck and his work here. And the painting is widely accepted as the first Hispano-Flemish style. I mean, you could see, particularly in the facial details, the Flemish style going on. Unlike the Flemish style, though, there's no disguised symbolism here. The Spanish preferred a very direct representation. So we see that going on. This is an oil painting. Most of the ones, all of them are oils that we'll talk about. And so we've got the Madonna with her counselors. The next up is Fernando Gallo. This is a Pieta. There's quite a few that we'll see. He was born in Salamanca around 1440, and he's from the Castilian school. He's a master from the Castilian school. This is one of the first times we see landscape being prominent in Spanish painting. There's a clear influence here from the Flemish, although we have these really rigid figures in awkward poses, which is, it's very unusual, right? This is probably done as a funeral piece for a monument. And the real reference we see here is from, and I'm going to screw up this name, so I apologize, Rogier van de Weyden. So I'm sorry if I got that name wrong. My Northern European isn't the best. This is another Pieta, and I just want to show the two of them side by side because there's a lot here between the two where we see the similarities, including the arch across the top. They are not referenced one after the other, but I suspect probably that Bemejo saw the other one. And so we see, I don't know if you can tell, there is, it's black across the top, but there is an arc across the top of it here, a very similar formula for the composition. So Bemejo continues the Flemish trend. We have Flemish figures here, more landscape. He's the first Spanish painter that really takes on the Flemish style of using glazes. And we won't be able to see that here on Zoom. But the way that the light shines through all of the glazes is absolutely amazing. He also starts using hidden symbolism. So that's new. So this comes in with, we start to see symbolism like in Flemish art. And we start to see the more dramatized art that we'll see in the later Spanish styles. Next up is Barguete. He's another major artist from the Castilian school, and he was probably born in Palencia. In 1488, we start to see a recorded history for him. He was employed by the Cathedral of Toledo, although little remains from when he worked there. The Italian influence is really clear in everything we see going on here, from the composition to the colors and the way the figures are put together and the drapery. He's leaning towards an earlier Italian style than what's going on in Italy at the time. That's because if you think about the fact that it takes a long time to travel from Italy to Spain, we're going to see things that are older. And since a lot of the Spanish painters are seeing things that are brought into Spain, like prints or copies, they're not actually traveling to Italy. So we're going to see styles that are slightly behind what's going on in Italy or in the northern region, but they are catching up. So it is possible, though, that Barguete did travel to Italy and possibly worked with Urbino, but either way, we clearly see the Italian influence. Notably, he worked on the altarpieces for Santo Tomas, and those patrons were Isabella and Ferdinand and Torquemada. So he had really important patrons, and he was a very important painter at the time. Next up is Grayovasco. I want to try and include Portuguese artists as well, since this was about Iberian art, although my focus is more Spanish. There was not a lot to find about Grayovasco, but there is a fabulous website for his museum. And this particular painting that he did, I really enjoyed, was St. Peter. He's known as the Great Vasco, and he is one of the master Portuguese painters of the time. This was an altarpiece for the cathedral in Viseu, which is the town where he lived. And you can see a mix of the Italian going on with the background and all of the detailing, and then the Flemish influences. And there were a lot of Flemish painters working for the cathedral at this time. You can see it in the figures. The colors, though, were a lot more muted. We're starting to see a real trend towards Iberian art having its own particular type of style. All right. This is Fernando Ynezdel Medina. I'm just going to call him Fernando for right now. I love this painting, and if you look at it, you're probably going to notice that it looks a lot like Da Vinci. And he did work with Da Vinci, which is why we're starting to see the facial expressions and the way that the whole figure is treated feels a lot like Da Vinci's paintings. He was active in Valencia, but he did go to Italy and he worked there. The painting he may have worked on with Leonardo da Vinci is the Battle of Angari. Sorry about my pronunciations, folks, but if you have questions about it, I'll be happy to drop the actual names into the chat for you. What's also interesting going on here is that we're also seeing the references to symbolism related to St. Catherine's story. We're not seeing a depiction of her death. Instead, it is very, very symbolized here. It's almost like she's an actor on a stage, and we feel that with this very flat background and just a few notable objects. And we'll see that later in the portraiture style for Spanish court painting is just a few notable objects. But look at the amazing attention to detail in the clothing and the way the drapery is treated. This is very, very much Italian, and we're really seeing an influence coming in here. All right. I just wanted to get a close-up on the features in her face because you really, really can see the relationship to Da Vinci's figures here. This is Juan de Juanas. His father was also a painter who was really heavily influenced by Raphael. This Saint Stephen was painted as an altarpiece in San Esteban in Valencia. He also did a Last Supper, which is this one, which is a clear reference to Da Vinci. But unlike Da Vinci's, we see Christ holding up the Eucharist. This is a reference to a very heated debate going on in the time about transubstantiation, where the wafer it becomes the body of Christ. And of course, with the Reformation going on, a lot of people believe that that's not true, but for Catholics, it is true. So Juanes is really trying to reference that Christ means that this is the body of Christ. I'm also personally a fan of the fact that all of the disciples are labeled in their halos so that we can tell who they are.
Did you turn the video off?
I did.
Next up is Antonis Moore. He is not Spanish of origin, and his full name is Antonis Moore van de Horst, but we'll call him Antonis Moore. He was a court painter for the Spanish and Portuguese courts. He was introduced to the Habsburgs and worked for Charles V and later for Philip II. We see a heavy Titian influence here. Remember, Philip II was a huge fan of Titian and had him as his unofficial court painter. We see a lot of Titian here. This is Mary Tudor. Antonis Moore traveled with Philip II when he went north and painted this when Philip was married to Mary Tudor. We also have this Spanish portraiture style, very rigid pose, dark background, very few symbols. He is really the originator of this court painting style that we see at this time period. So he's the start. And here's another of his portraits. This is Mary of Austria. Again, rigid pose, major attention to detail all through the clothing, but very few articles or things that they're holding. There's not a whole lot of symbolism and a dark background. And this is Coello. His work was heavily influenced by Moore. You can see the relationship between the two painters if we look at them. He is emblematically Spanish in everything. Look at the attention to detail throughout the clothing. I'm sure some of you are having garb envy. I know I am. Very rigid though. And just to note, Coello, also working for Philip II, also worked at El Escorial. So he's one of the painters on that project. And here's another very interesting costume. I wanted to make sure that we include some of the male portraiture. A lot of what I have here is female portraiture because that was available through Wikicommons, but some male stuff for everyone. Next up is Sofonisba Anguisola. She is also not Spanish, she is Italian, but she is very, very notable. While we know that there were women doing painting, in fact, we have mention of them all throughout history, a lot of times they have no names. And most of art history, we don't have any names attached to people until we get into the medieval period. Anguisola is one of the first notable female painters that is recognized by name. She was born in Cremona in Italy. She is the eldest of 6 daughters. And her father was a minor noble, and that's also really extraordinary. Normally, when we see female painters, we see them working with their father, who's also a painter, but she is a painter in her own right. And she's very clever with her paintings. And we also see her bringing in the Italian Mannerist style. So we see a lot of emotion. We're starting to see, we're losing that rigidness that we were seeing before. And so she was in Milan, and she was introduced to the court of Spain in 1558 and was asked to join the Spanish court as a lady in waiting, and asked also as a court painter. So she moved to Spain and she was a court painter for 20 years for the Spanish court. She was a lady in waiting for Isabel de Valois. Sorry about the names, folks. We have lost a lot of the paintings from her time period in Spain. They were lost, but there are quite a few. And, you know, she's really famous in this time period. She's unusual. She's a celebrity. People are very interested in what she's doing, and she's got beautiful paintings. So this is a self-portrait she did in Italy. I wanted to show you this one. This is before her time in Spain. Most of her notable paintings are from her Italian period of her family. These are her siblings playing chess. And they are much more expressive, which is why they're more prominent. But you've probably noted some of the portraiture that she's done if you've been looking at Spanish portraiture for garb ideas. This is a self-portrait that she did, which again, with the cleverness, she is painting her teacher, painting herself. That might remind you of Velázquez, kind of the inception moment going on, unrelated, of course, but very, very clever. You will note that there are more arms than belong in this painting. As part of the restoration process, they uncovered the fact that she had originally intended the arm to be up, and then in the final restoration, the hand that's facing down is the one that they kept. So they uncovered that she actually changed a little bit of the composition. Here's one of her Spanish court paintings. Again, we start to see her using the traditional Spanish portraiture style with dark backgrounds and the heavy attention to detail. We're still seeing the mannerism happening, but it's much more muted, and we're seeing the Spanish presence here. She was not as active as some of the other court painters because she was also working as a lady in waiting, but the stuff that she did produce is absolutely stunning. And here's a little boy. I think his hat is just hysterical, so I wanted to show him to you. She did quite a few paintings from the Spanish court. Next up is Luis de Morales. I've included this from his collection because since we're going to talk about El Greco last, this painting really reminds me of El Greco, and the two are unrelated, and I'm not sure that they ever saw each other's paintings. But you can see Luis de Morales has this expression and mysticism going on that we also see in El Greco's paintings, and they arrived at it separately, which is just fascinating. We're seeing both the Flemish and the Italian styles here, especially Titian. This was one with a pair that were both hung in El Pardo. There's not a whole lot of details that we can find about Luis de Morales. He was from Extremadura, which is on the Portuguese border. He was very popular during his time, which is why we see a lot of copies that have survived. But Philip II did not like his work. He also wasn't good at, well-versed in frescoes, so he wasn't going to be used on the El Escorial project. It's very late Gothic, though. He was considered old-fashioned and leaning more towards the Portuguese trends, with the expressiveness and the mystic yearning and the gloomy atmospheres. He's less Spanish, though, but definitely not, even though he's referencing Italian and Titian, it's not Italian. Here's another one of his, another Pieta, as we see lots of versions. All right, next up is Juan Fernandez Navarette. He was known as El Mudo because he was a deaf mute. His style is blending the landscape from the Netherlands with the Italian styles of Raphael and Michelangelo. I'm sure you can see with, especially with the drapery, the Italian reference. He was the premier painter in Spain at the time, and he studied Titian's work closely. And remember, Titian never came to Spain, but he was sending paintings to Spain for Philip II, and Navarette had access to them as he was one of Philip II's court painters. He mastered the Italian style, and he was on the project for El Escorial until he died. He was one of Philip II's favorites. Here's another one of his. You can really see the Italian in the background, and we're starting to see in this the emotion without being mannerist, still high Renaissance, but this is why he was one of Philip II's favorites. You can really see the it's not stiff. He's really incorporated everything that we see from the Italian style with portraying scenes. All right, the man of the hour, El Greco. El Greco is one of my favorite painters. He always has been. As as you can see in the background. This is called the Portrait of the Old Man. It's probably a self-portrait, and if you look at some of the other portraits of El Greco, you can see that it definitely looks like him. This is from later in life, though. This is at the right around 1600. He did paint until 1614, so I'm not going to talk about the paintings that happen later. They become even more expressive, but we'll only go up to 1600. His name is El Greco, means the Greek. He was born in Crete. His name is Dominikos Theo. I'm gonna screw up all of the names. I'm so sorry, folks, because I only read them. Theotokopoulos, sorry. He was born in Canida. I'm just gonna give up with the names, in 1541, which was a Venetian territory. He did start painting in Crete, and we know that he was actually an icon painter, but then he moved to Venice in 1560 to study there. It's possible that he was a student of Titian's or studied with him. We also know he was heavily influenced by Tintoretto. Whether or not he was a student doesn't matter. He was definitely heavily influenced by Titian and many other Italian artists at the time. His style is Italian Mannerist. Let's take a moment to talk about Italian Mannerism. At the time, Mannerism, it was kind of a dig. You didn't want to be a Mannerist. You wanted to be one of the high Renaissance painters. Mannerism takes on expressive nature, a mysticism, and we see that going on here. It really means individual manner, and certainly El Greco is an island unto himself as far as styles are concerned. There's no one before like him, and there's no one in Spanish painting afterwards that's really like his art. We move into the Baroque, and we don't see El Greco passing his style down to future Spanish painters, although a lot of them reference him, and we're certainly fans of him. So in 1570, he went to Rome, and he joined a painter's academy. He set up a workshop. His goal, though, was to paint altarpieces, and while he was there, he didn't receive any commissions for those. Possibly what happened is that he criticized Michelangelo's work, he had recently died. And of course, everybody loved Michelangelo, so he was ostracized for not having a great opinion of Michelangelo. Interestingly, though, we see a lot of references to Michelangelo's work, and he wrote about him in his writings, and included clear references to Michelangelo's work in his paintings. So probably a little bit of envy going on, since his goal is to do altarpieces, and you've got Michelangelo with things like the Sistine Chapel. It's really the person he wanted to be. So maybe the criticism was a little bit of professional envy going on. In 1577, he moved to Spain. He tried to become a court painter for Philip II, but just like with the other painter, Philip hated his style. So that wasn't going to work. He moved to Toledo, and he fell in with the crowd of intellectuals. And he sets up shop, and he's commissioned to paint 3 altarpieces. So he finally gets to do his altarpieces. But the painting, before we get to the Count of Orgas, which of course is his most famous painting, I wanted to show something that came from his period in Italy. This is Christ Healing the Blind. It is an unfinished painting, which we can see if I note here. You can see in the corner, there's unfinished strokes. And if we look at the figures, you can see the hands are not finished, and the figures are still like roughed in. He never finished it, but if you look at this, you probably think this doesn't look like El Greco at all. This looks like an Italian Renaissance painting, and you wouldn't think it was his. He's trying to emulate the high Renaissance style, but we can see that he's having trouble with some of the figures. He does have the classic V composition, but I can note quite a few errors going on, including the fact that, and this is probably why he didn't finish it, the bright pink areas in the painting are where your eye goes first. And because of the movement of the figures all in one direction, your eye focuses on that guy's butt cheek. So it should be focusing on Christ. And I'm sure he struggled figuring out how to resolve the composition to bring it back where it belonged, which is why he never finished it. Just wanted to bring in, I did actually go see the Count of Orgas in person. This is some of the lovely Spanish tile that is outside of the museum. And in the other photo, this is the outside of the El Greco Museum, which is set up also as his house. This is the burial of the Count of Orgas, which of course is El Greco's most famous painting. The thing I love about this is that he is a master of Easter eggs. This painting is packed with all sorts of things in here. We have two different styles going on in the painting. At the top, we're seeing the heavens are done with one very expressive, lots of fluid movement going on at the top. At the bottom, we have the figures set up in the somber, very court painterly style of Spanish painting. The figures at the bottom, they are, here, let's, before we get to that, this is the space where the painting is located, which is the burial of the Count of Orgas. The painting is massive. I don't know if you can see from this particular picture how tall it is, but it is absolutely huge. If you're watching this on the recording later, this picture is copyrighted, so it will be blurred out. So please go find the museum for Santo Tomé in Toledo, and you can see this picture. Here's the bottom of the painting so we can get a closer look at the figures. All of these are 16th century notable people in Toledo at the time that El Greco was commissioned to do this painting. He had 9 months to complete the project, and you can see just how huge it is, and he did live up to the task. The Count of Orgas was kind of a local hero, and there was a story that the saints appear, St. Augustine and St. Stephen appeared miraculously to lay him in his tomb. So the priest for Santo Tomé commissioned El Greco to paint the burial scene. And so, but since the Count of Orgas had died a few centuries earlier, we're seeing the local nobles at the time. These are their self-portraits, and the locals in Toledo like to come see all of their friends and stuff painted in here. I just wanted to give a close-up at the way that the saints are done, and also the Count of Orgas. If ever El Greco's ability to do Italian style is questioned, it stops here. Look at the immense attention to detail and the perfection that happens in the figures. Also, what's hard to note, because it doesn't come through on the screen, is that the grayness in the Count's face really in person is, it's striking in a way that you really can't see her on the screen. I wanted to point out two figures here in the painting. The one in the back, that's El Greco. He did paint himself into the painting. And the one at the bottom, that is his son, Jorge Manuel. And on his handkerchief is inscribed the date 1578, which was the year that the boy was born. And this is the top half of this painting. We can see a whole pantheon of saints, and all of their symbolism is referenced here. The style is much lighter, much more fluid. And right here, you can note the soul of Count Orgas is in the angel's hands being cradled as it's lifted up into the heavens to be with all of the saints. This is the full painting, so everyone can appreciate it. It's absolutely stunning. If you get a chance to see it, please do. It's completely amazing in person. And like I said, the scale is hard to tell on screen, but it's the figures are life-size. Next up, this is the Madonna and Child with Saint Martina and Saint Agnes. I wanted to show some more of just a breadth of El Greco's style. You can see these beautiful colors. He has his very own way of doing things with these elongated necks and almost gaunt figures, where Michelangelo was seeking the paragon of man with the muscular structure and exaggeration of form in that direction. El Greco is exaggerating their spiritual nature. So he's really lifting the figures up as if they're going to heaven. It's unlike the other painters that we see happening at the same time, including Anguisola. Sorry with the names. This is Saint Martin the Beggar. He lived during the time of Constantine. The armor that he has done is Damascus, which is local to Toledo. And in the background behind the horse in the far distance, we can actually see the scene of Toledo and the Tagus River in the background. And then we see the scene from the story of Saint Martin helping the beggar. This is Christ carrying the cross, the first one. There are several. I love this painting for its expressive nature, him looking up, and you really get this sense of hope and spiritualness and mysticism, and the way that the fingers are treated. It's very, very, very intentional that certain areas are focused on. And then if you look at the cross, it's barely roughed in there. And this isn't a later one. So I did go slightly past our time period, but I wanted to show some of the other ways that he treated it. So just to show back and forth, the original, much, much more Italian style. And then we can see he's even further down into the way that he treats the forms with a free stroke of paint on the canvas. After the time period that we're talking about, his paintings fell out of favor and he really disappeared into obscurity. He was not really noted until the 1800s when there were artists and writers who discovered him, again, including Manet. And so they loved his work and they thought he was great. And so now El Greco is a famous artist, but he did fall into obscurity for a while. And the reason I think that we have artists like Manet really, really liking El Greco's work is they refer to him almost as a proto-impressionist. And you can kind of see that with the way that he treats the paint on the canvas, where certain areas are very just fluid and brushed in, and other areas are very detailed, much closer to what we see going on in the Renaissance and the Mannerist movement. All right, the last painting, because I know I'm supposed to finish up in a few minutes. This is one of my favorites. It is the view of Toledo. It is a storm over the city of Toledo. And El Greco, the master of Photoshop before Photoshop existed. When we look at the view of Toledo here, these buildings don't exist in this setting the way that they are. In fact, here's a picture of Toledo side by side with the painting. And you'll notice that the Alcazar and the cathedral steeple are much further apart. In fact, they're so far apart that they would not be in the way that we see in El Greco's painting. He's completely changed the way that the landscape works in order to have a better painting. We see the whole city there, and then the Tagus down below. The small city that looks like it's off to the side, that's actually a monastery, which is gone. But I love the fact that you can actually look and go stand in Toledo today, and you can really see the image that he has painted. The city hasn't changed a whole lot, from at least from standing on the far shores and looking out. Obviously, you can't get the perfect camera picture of the way that the buildings line up because he intentionally distorted the way that the city is bringing the buildings closer. Those being, of course, the two powerhouses, the state and the church, with the two tallest buildings. This is a view of the eastern section from the north. I think we'll stop there and answer questions.
Okay, there aren't any questions. Whoops, somebody's mentioned you left out Velasquez.
So I didn't leave out Velasquez because his paintings are later. So these paintings, we're only talking about Spanish painters up through 1500 or 1600. So Velasquez is later. But I agree. And I absolutely adore Las Meninas. It's a fabulous painting, but that's way later. All right. Okay, that's fine. It's a joke.
Okay. That's it for on chat. If anybody wants to just unmute and ask questions, please go for it. No, no questions. Lots of people saying how wonderful the class was.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Well, it's 1:45, so if it's all right, I will stop recording here.
All right.